Welcome everyone to week 6, and we are just about 6 days away from Christmas. And it's exciting that we're very close to Christmas. And despite the holiday season, we have about 6 students joining tonight's tutorial on immunity. The topic on immunity again is important because last week we talked about jurisdiction. And when we talked about jurisdiction, we said that as a matter of international law, based mainly on customary international law, it is acknowledged that states have jurisdiction, especially over their territory. And the jurisdiction of states, first of all, relates to its prescriptive power to create laws pertaining to events and subjects within its territory. And of course, it also has the ability to extend its jurisdiction and reach beyond even its territory, as we discussed last week. At the same time, we also said that another aspect of jurisdiction relates to the enforcement jurisdiction, or the ability of a state to actually enforce its laws, especially its criminal jurisdiction. So that can pertain to arresting individuals for having committed crimes. And at the same time, we talked about judicial jurisdiction, which is quite common to a lot of us. When we speak of jurisdiction, we often understand it as the power of a court to make a determination on legal questions or to make judgments pertaining to civil or criminal cases. Now, when we look at international law, you've probably heard of immunity, the word immunity. And there are at least 2 aspects to it. One is immunity of the state itself, and the other one is the immunity of the people representing the state. Because, the state is an artificial entity, and we know that a state can only act through individuals or through persons. And on the one hand, when you speak about immunity, it's the immunity of a state from suit, but at the same time, we talk about immunity of, either diplomatic officers or consular officers from arrest and detention. That leads to a very controversial issue early on, because when you look back to prior to 1960, the idea was that states had absolute immunity from suit. So in other words, if you were a private company and you had a commercial engagement, you entered into a commercial contract with a state. Let's say you supplied tons of sugar, or perhaps tons of rice, or you probably supplied boots, or you supplied even weapons to a state. And let's assume that at some point, the state decided not to pay you. Can you imagine the situation where, if you follow the concept of immunity from suit and it were to be based on an absolute principle of state immunity, you don't have any recourse against a state at all. And so that raises a question. What exactly is the relevant principle today pertaining to state immunity? And we're going to be discussing that tonight. And we will see that in international law, we make a distinction. The states and international law has now moved essentially to that point where instead of the idea of an absolute immunity of states from suit, there is now the idea of restrictive state immunity, which is the same law which is found in Australia on the basis of the Foreign States Immunities Act of 1983. The other aspect of immunity relates to the idea of immunity from arrest or immunity from detention. I'm just going to mute everyone in the meantime. So, imagine instances when you have an ambassador, and I was just reading a novel by Lee Child, about a month ago, and and I would imagine that this can happen oftentimes. It involved a situation of an ambassador who had a propensity of raping women in the state where he was assigned to. And the question then is, if that ambassador, if there is in fact evidence that the ambassador committed rape or even committed murder, can he be subject to arrest? And the other question might be, assuming that he was actually caught in flagrante delicto, meaning in the act itself, can he be arrested, or can he actually just escape from arrest simply because he happens to be the ambassador of a state? And is there a distinction between crimes being committed, let's say grave crimes being committed by an ambassador as opposed to somebody who is a member of of a consulate, meaning a consular officer? Or do they have the same kind of immunity from arrest or detention? The other part of it, of course, is the idea of, you've probably heard of the idea of dirty bombs. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, the idea of dirty bombs is that it is possible for nuclear warheads, is it warheads, is that the correct term? But it's possible to have materials, bomb materials, which are capable of nuclear explosion, and they can be of a very small size, probably even hidden in a bag. And I think there have been a lot of movies in the past which depicted instances of these dirty bombs, meaning nuclear weapons in very small sizes, which are hidden in bags. Imagine if you had an ambassador or even a consul general who put a dirty bomb inside a diplomatic pouch, and in the course of a particular state examining the contents of a bag through one of its machines, it was uncovered that there seems to be a bomb there. It could be bombs, it could be drugs, and so it could be illegal drugs and so on. The question is, can those diplomatic pouches or bags be opened? And if it was the bag of a consular officer or of a diplomat, can any of them be arrested? These are interesting questions, aren't they? Don't you think? And what exactly would happen if a diplomat or an ambassador were arrested by a receiving state? So these are questions that we examine tonight in our tutorial on immunity. So after studying this topic, you should be able to discuss and explain the customary law of state immunity, who are entitled to claim immunity, and Australia's approach to state immunity. Now, before I continue, would any of you have any question? If I remember correctly, Michael is also in the Defense Forces, aren't you, Michael? Michael Palmer. Would that be correct, Michael?
Sorry, just unmuting. Manjo, no, I'm not at all. Sorry.
Oh, you're not at all? Okay.
Must have been confused with someone else.
Okay, yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah, I do know that Jack is with the Defense Forces. Okay. Any questions so far before we continue? So we're good. So we could begin. I've actually prepared 6 tutorial questions for us tonight to dig deep into the topic on immunity. Okay, so the first thing we're going to do is to go through the quiz question, because it does provide a very good overview of the principle of immunity in international law. Can I just get a volunteer to read the discussion question for us? Just to read the question, and then we will try to answer the question as a class. Can I get a volunteer?
I'll do it, Manjo.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you.
The Ministry of Defence of Kandoma ordered boots for its armed forces from Rutamu. The ship which brought the goods from Rutamu experiences difficulties when it arrives at the port in Kandoma due to ongoing construction work in parts of the port. The goods entered into demurrage. The Ratamuan Shipping Company asked for payment, but Kandoma refused. The company sued Kandoma before the Ratamuan government court, asking the court to grant its application to seize some property belonging to Kandoma in Rutamu. Kandoma argued that the court has no jurisdiction on the basis of immunity, advised the parties.
Okay, which of the following statements is the most correct answer? Can you continue going through the choices, Peter?
As soon as I can read them.
Okay, it should come up in a short while.
Okay. A, the Rootamoon Court has jurisdiction since the state of Kandoma entered into a transaction with a private shipping company which is not subject of international law. B, the Rootamoon Court has jurisdiction since the principle of fairness cannot, I can't read that
Permit.
word there, a state that is a party to a commercial transaction to evade its legal obligations. Oh, it must be permit.
Permit.
Cannot permit a state that is a party to a commercial transaction to evade its legal obligations. C, the Rootamoon Court has jurisdiction since Kandomian Minister of Defence engaged in a commercial act and is thus not entitled to state immunity. D, the Rootamoon Court has no jurisdiction since the Kandomian Ministry of Defence engaged in a sovereign or public act and is thus entitled to state immunity. And E, all the answers are wrong.
Thank you. Can I just ask everyone to try to attempt to answer this particular question, which is quiz 5 for this week, by providing an answer, by choosing a letter as your answer and put your answers in the chat box, and we will take it from there. C, for some it's C, that the Rootamoon Court has jurisdiction because the Kandoman Ministry of Defense engaged in a commercial act. Some have answered D, in the sense that the Rootamoon Court has the jurisdiction because the Kandoman Ministry of Defense engaged in a sovereign or public act. So the class essentially is quite split, although a strong majority of the class chose C as the correct answer. Okay. Would anyone wish to turn on his or her mic to try to provide an explanation as to why you chose a particular answer?
Okay, Manjo, I'll go
Thank
since
you.
I'm presenting. Okay. So I think that the whole ordering of boots,
Yes.
you need to determine what kind of act that is. Is it a commercial act or is it a public sovereign act? Now, the boots are for the defense forces of Rootamoon, which I think would meet sovereign act. And based on that, they will have immunity because the action was sovereign, not commercial.
Okay.
I disagree with that, Manjo, because I think although it's a commercial act because it's clothing the defence forces, it's not building a hospital or anything like that. It's a commercial act. That's what I believe, and so I've gone for C.
Well, so let's just use another example. What if it's the Ministry of Health of a particular state, and that Ministry of Health ordered containers of particular medicines and then decided not to pay for those medicines? Would that be a commercial act, or would that be considered a sovereign or public act? Because the medicines in that particular case ordered by a state Ministry of Health would obviously be for the public, for its citizens. Would that be a commercial or a sovereign or public act?
I think that would be a commercial act.
Okay. Let's take it further. Let's assume that they have a Ministry of Telecommunications and they ordered commercial satellites from another state. It's intended really to assist in the satellites and communications of a particular state. Is that a commercial or a sovereign act? What do the others think? I'm just asking questions here. I haven't really said, what's correct or wrong.
I still think that that's commercial.
Yeah, okay. That's right. So, who was that?
It's me, Manjo. I agree with Peter. Yeah, I think it's a commercial act.
That's right. So the correct answer is it is considered a commercial act. So And the particular example here is actually the case of Trentex, which was a decision made by the UK Court of Appeal. And in that specific case, the Nigerian government, through the Ministry of Defense, had sought not to pay for cement that they had ordered for its infrastructure projects. But the court ruled that even if it had been army boots that had been ordered, that would still be considered a commercial transaction. So the rule is today, based on the principle of restrictive state immunity, so we no longer have the principle of absolute state immunity. Based on the principle of restrictive state immunity, if a state engages in a commercial transaction, then in that particular instance, the state cannot claim immunity from suit. And the main reason for that is that starting in the 1960s, a lot of states had actually gotten involved in commercial transactions, right? We've seen it in Australia. So you probably had Australia Post at some point being owned by the Commonwealth government. You probably had the Commonwealth Bank owned by the Commonwealth government. So in the 1960s, based on the principle of laissez-faire, a lot of states got engaged in commercial transactions. And after a while, it became very onerous on the part of private firms to be dealing with states to supply the goods, and then for the states deciding not to pay anything. And so that has now been changed as a rule. The international law concerning state immunity is that if a state engages in a commercial transaction, or what is known as acts iuri gestionis, then a state would not be immune from suit. It is only when a state is engaged in sovereign or public acts that a state is immune from suit. Any questions? So let me just jump to question 6, because it's very relevant here.
Manjo,
Yes.
Can you just define what a sovereign act is?
I can show that by going to question 6. Okay. I'll give an example. Can somebody read question 6 for us?
Hold on.
Thank you.
The Maryland Air Force made a mistake on a bombing run of terrorist targets in the state of Candyland and ended up killing 18 innocent civilians. The state of Candyland intends to sue the state of Maryland and the courts of Candyland for indemnity for the deaths of the innocent civilians. Advise the state of Candyland about the prospects of such legal action.
Mm-hmm. What do you think?
I think that one's a sovereign act, Manjo.
Why is that?
Pardon? What was that?
Why is that? Why do you think that's a sovereign act?
Well, it's basically it's not a commercial act.
Mm-hmm.
Basically, so I mean it's you basically can't sue another state. They state immunity where they have for a decision, well, for anything other than a commercial act. So you're really looking at it being a sovereign act.
Very good. That's an example of a sovereign act. So remember the case of the invasion by Iraq of Kuwait. Was it in 1985 or thereabouts? I can't remember when it was, but probably in the 1980s, was it? Or early
1990, around that time, Manjo.
1989.
Huh? No, the first one.
Yeah, 1990 or 1989, something like that.
The war started in January 1990.
Okay, very good.
The invasion was 2nd of August, 90.
Okay. So thank you. So you will recall that Iraq, through Saddam Hussein, invaded Kuwait, and the monarchy of Kuwait actually had to flee Kuwait and sought refuge in Saudi Arabia, if I'm not mistaken. There was so much damage to the kingdom of Kuwait, including, before Saddam Hussein, the army of Saddam Hussein departed from Kuwait, they destroyed a lot of the oil refineries. they obviously destroyed the Air Force of Kuwait and did a lot of damage to the country. Okay, the question is, in international, and let's assume that actually after Iraq, fled Kuwait because the United States came in to protect Kuwait during the first Gulf War. Iraq actually had a lot of assets in the UK, for example. It had a lot of assets there. And let's assume that the Kuwait government decided to pursue, the state of, to sue the state of Iraq for indemnity and for damage to Kuwait as a result of the first Gulf War. And let's assume that it went to a UK court for the purpose of seeking to file a civil action and claim damages against the state of Iraq in the UK. How do you suppose would a court rule on a defense by the Iraqi government that it is immune from suit? Assuming that we can all agree that the acts of Iraq were illegal. Let's assume that the acts of Iraq were illegal. How would a UK court rule on a defense coming from the Iraqi government that it is immune from suit? What do you think? Was the question clear? This is factual. What do you think?
I'm sure I've read that they can't sue for in tort.
Yeah, they can't. Iraq would still be immune from suit because the acts of Iraq, even if they were illegal in international law, would still be subject to state immunity because it was a sovereign act. You probably have heard of the case of Augusto Pinochet, the former dictator of Argentina. He fled to the UK after a while, and he was sued by the heirs of a lot of the victims of torture, and I think they were called desaparecidos. Is that correct? I mean, that disappeared. So a lot of there were thousands upon thousands of people who died during the military dictatorship of Augusto Pinochet, and he fled to the UK, and they sought to the heirs sought to seize the properties of the Argentinian government in the UK on the ground that the Argentinian government committed human rights violations and committed tort. The question is, if the Argentinian government raised a defense of state immunity, do you think it would be accepted by the courts of the UK? What do you think? What do you think? Let's take the case of Australia. So as a result of the boat, what's the policy now? The turn back the boats policy of Australia. And let's assume that by turning back the boats, these refugee boats in the international waters, some of them capsized and a lot of individuals drowned. By doing so, this was because of the Australian Navy turning back the boats to go back into international waters. The question is, could the Australian government be sued? Let's say, assuming that the Australian government has properties in some other state, such as the US, and the US has an Alien Torts Act, and let's assume that these relatives of the victims, of those who had died as a result of the boat capsizing because of the actions of the Australian Navy, they sued on the on the basis of a tortuous action on the part of the Australian government, can the Australian government claim immunity from suit?
I would have thought they would have immunity, Manjo. I wouldn't thought they'd be able to be sued, would they?
That's right. They would. The Australian government would be immune from suit. So again, these are examples of sovereign acts. Are we clear? So these are examples of sovereign acts. Now, if you have a government entity which engages in a commercial transaction, and this, under the Foreign State Immunities Act 1985 Commonwealth of Australia, that particular enactment provides that when a foreign state engages in a commercial transaction, that commercial transaction can no longer be, would mean that a state would no longer be immune from suit if it engages in a commercial transaction under the Foreign State Immunities Act of 1985 Commonwealth in Australia. So are we clear? So do we have a good idea now what the difference between government acts and commercial acts? So as far as the sovereign acts of a state, it doesn't really matter if a particular state may have engaged in something illegal under international law. So for as long as the act is a sovereign or public act, that particular state would be immune from suit in the courts of other states. So we're good? We're clear?
Can I ask a question?
Yes, Michael.
Just to be clear, so going back to that original example that you posed right at the start of the session where you've got, say, a diplomat in a foreign country.
Mm-hmm.
For example, if this diplomat was doing something crazy like running down the street, shooting people or something like that, he could be taken out because that's not a foreign act. I mean, it's not a commercial act, but it's not a sovereign act, I meant. It's not a commercial act, but because it's not a sovereign act, the police in that country could take him down because he's doing something that kind of immediately, poses a danger to that country, right?
Interesting question. Interesting question. My immediate answer would probably be that, assuming that that person is in fact accredited as a diplomat, he cannot be killed. He cannot, because there are two aspects to immunity. Initially, when we talked about immunity, we were talking about immunity from suit of a state. So in other words, we're mainly talking about civil action. The example that Michael talks now is actually immunity of persons, of certain persons which represent a state. That's a different thing. Now, let's assume the example which was given by Michael, which is a very good question. Let's assume that, as pointed out by Michael, a diplomat, and we're being very specific here, it's a diplomat, not a consular officer. Let's assume that a diplomat committed a private act in, killing people. And the question was, would the police of a foreign state have the power to kill that particular diplomat for the purpose of defense? What do you think?
Technically, no, but for practical purposes, probably.
Yeah, the answer is likely to be no. And in fact, if you kill a diplomat, it is an act of war. It is an act of war. If you go back to World War I, the reason why World War I started was the Prince of Austria, who was said to have been assassinated, and as a result, Germany invaded or something. Who knows? Who knows?
It was Archduke Franz Ferdinand.
Oh, sorry.
Archduke Franz Ferdinand.
Ah, okay. And who invaded which country? Was it Germany invading Austria? So that was a pretext for World War.
That was the the initial sparking point. There were lots of things surrounding it, but yeah, it saw Germany invade Austria in alliance against the Hungaro-Austrian alliance.
Yeah. So to kill a diplomat is an act of war. So, state.
Just on,
Yes. So was that?
Jamie, just on that, I read something the other day in the immunity section that I can't find again now, but it was something about they didn't have immunity if they were threatening the government of the state or something about that. Does that ring any bells?
Sorry, what's the question? What was it again? You said, Jamie?
What happens if a diplomat's like if they're threatening security or a government of the state? Are they still immune?
They can do two things. They can revoke the accreditation of the diplomat, in which case the diplomat has to leave the state.
Yep.
Or they can do that as well by declaring the diplomat persona non grata. But again, even in those two instances, they will have to give reasonable time for the diplomat to leave the state, but they cannot arrest him, and certainly they cannot hurt the diplomat. Again, because that would be a declaration of war.
That's been shown recently, that Manjo, with the Khashoggi incident in Turkey, where he was killed within the Saudi Arabian embassy.
That's right.
And they know who did it, but they can't arrest him because they've got diplomatic immunity.
That's right. Okay. There's a second point. I've got a second question too, which goes into this particular question here. We're talking about immunity of diplomats and consular officers. So can we just go to this to question 2? Can I get somebody to read question 2 for us? Question 2.
You're right. I'll give it a go.
Thank you, Jack.
The Ontario police was called to a residence where one of its occupants had reported a domestic incident. When policemen arrived at the residence and knocked on its door, they were met by a blood-soaked gentleman who introduced himself as James Blast, the Consul General of the state of Lunario. Mr. Blast then told the policeman that as the Lunarian Consul General, he was refusing them entry into the property. Antiquarian policemen who looked through the windows of the house could see that a bloodied woman was lying immobile on the floor. When one of the Antiquarian policemen called their headquarters, he was informed that Mr. Blast was an accredited diplomat of Antiquario, but that the house was not an accredited diplomatic residence. Given the tricky situation, you have been called as a solicitor to provide advice. Can the Antiquarian policeman enter the residence of Mr. Blast? Can he be arrested for committing a crime? Advise.
Okay, what do you think? Now, please take a note here that we're speaking of the Consul General of the state of Lunario, but at the same time, he has actually been accredited as a diplomat. Okay, so usually the diplomat is not the same as a consular officer, but in this particular case, under the Vienna Convention on Diplomatic Relations of 1961, it is possible, under the 1963 Vienna Convention on Consular Officers, it is possible for a consular officer to be accredited as a diplomat. And I will explain in a short while the distinction for the two. So let's assume, under the facts, that it is quite clear that the Consul General has really committed a crime. There are two questions here. One, can the Antiquarian police enter the residence of Mr. Blast? And two, can he be arrested for committing a crime?
I'll have a crack at it, Manjo.
Yes.
I would say on the first thing, because it's not an accredited diplomatic residence, it's therefore not the property of Antiquario. It's not of Lunario. It's still sovereign land of Antiquario. So they can enter the residence, but he's an accredited diplomat, so he can't be arrested for committing the crime.
Very good. Now, let's just change the facts a bit. There are some states which are quite small, and it's possible that you may have a consular officer, and that consular officer actually has the residence of the consular officer is also where they do a lot of the consular functions. You've probably seen that in some places. Okay, so you've got a consular officer, and it is in the consulate that the consular officer also lives. But that particular place where the consular officer lives in also is used exclusively for consular functions. Okay? Question. In that particular circumstance, where you have an office that is used exclusively for consular functions, can the police or, any officer of a host state enter the premises for the purpose, for example, of conducting a search or, for the purpose of solving a crime?
No, they can't enter.
They cannot enter. That's under the 1963 Vienna Convention on Consular Officers. They cannot enter if the premises are used exclusively for consular affairs. If it were an embassy, for as long as it is an embassy, because it is considered to be foreign soil, there is no way that a foreign government can enter the premises, an embassy. So you see a distinction between an embassy, which is considered to be foreign soil under international law, as opposed to premises used for consular affairs. The offices used for consular affairs are not deemed to be foreign soil, or the territory belonging to the foreign state, but only for as long as it is used exclusively for consular functions. It cannot be entered into. It is inviolable under the 1963 Vienna Convention on Consular Relations. So we're clear in relation to the answer? So in relation to the answer, the answer of Dean was correct. In relation to the factual scenario in question 2, because we're speaking here of an accredited diplomat of Ontario, we would have to assume that the residence is likely to be an accredited diplomatic residence, and therefore is considered to be foreign soil and the territory of the state of Lunario, and therefore it would be inviolable. Policemen are likely not going to be able to enter the residence of Mr. Blast. Now, can he be arrested for committing a crime? The answer is no, he cannot. Again, immunity from arrest. Both under customary international law and under the 1961 Vienna Convention on diplomatic relations, particularly Article 31.1.
Manjo?
Yes.
Sorry. Okay, so just in relation to that, does that diplomat not only have immunity while he holds office? And that crime, because, I mean, that's not if he's got a bloodied woman or I'm not sure, it's a blood-soaked gentleman and a bloodied woman, that's a crime. I don't think that is a sovereign act.
It is not a sovereign
act. So if he ceases to be the consul general and he is no longer that diplomat, does that immunity extend past that? Or is that where that ratione personae comes in?
That's a good question. My understanding here, and Ilionka, you might be able to shed more light on that. Article 31.1 of the 1961 Vienna Convention on Diplomatic Relations says that a diplomatic agent shall enjoy immunity from the criminal jurisdiction of the receiving state. So while that person has diplomatic accreditation, then he's immune from criminal jurisdiction. Now, the moment he loses the diplomatic accreditation, the answer would be that he is likely to be, he could possibly be arrested for a crime if he goes back. That's my understanding.
Yeah, I just wanted to, because in the textbook they make mention of, so it's two. The one is ratione personae, which is basically criminal acts that this person does as a diplomat or under his diplomatic immunity.
Yes.
But in his personal capacity, he still has immunity, but only for the duration before and during.
Yes.
And then he's got ratione materia, which is an official act. So I think it was in the Democratic Republic of Congo. There was a case of that minister where he enjoyed immunity of real human rights violations.
Yeah.
and that was something that went past. I mean, that's in perpetuity. He's got immunity.
Very good.
That's how it is.
So
Is my understanding right?
Absolutely, you're very correct there. So Ilionka has made a very good clarification for us, citing the case of the Democratic Republic of Congo, where if the acts of a diplomat are actually sovereign acts, the immunity from criminal suit or criminal action will persist even after that particular diplomat has ceased to be a diplomat or has lost diplomatic accreditation. So that's immunity forever. So that is the case with Augusto Pinochet as well. So even after Augusto Pinochet ceased to be the president of Argentina, because the acts of torture that were committed during his presidency, even if they were illegal, were considered to be sovereign or public acts, then Augusto Pinochet was immune from criminal action or criminal jurisdiction of the courts of a foreign state. However, we make a distinction in relation to private acts done by a diplomat, because if a criminal act is done by a diplomat and the criminal act is a private act, such as rape or such as murder, and it is done, there is no sovereign character to it, or there is no public character to it, in the sense that he probably did not assassinate somebody for a political purpose. If it were just purely a private act, then the immunity from the criminal jurisdiction of a receiving state would only persist up to the time that that diplomat remains an accredited diplomat or a diplomatic agent of a foreign government. The moment that that person ceases to be a diplomatic agent, then he can be subject to the criminal jurisdiction of the receiving state. So it's not so much immunity from criminal action per se. It's actually criminal jurisdiction of the receiving state during the time when a person is a diplomatic agent. So it's not immunity from doing any criminal act you like in a private criminal act, because you can still be subject to a criminal jurisdiction after you cease to be a diplomatic agent. It only means that during the time that you are a diplomatic agent, you are immune from the criminal jurisdiction of a receiving state. But it doesn't mean you have carte blanche authority to start killing people or burning villages out of as a private act. Okay, we're clear?
Yep. So Manjo, just coming back to a question you raised, I think, in the beginning of the course, with regards to the Filipino president.
Yeah.
So would he now enjoy, what he's doing to the drug traffickers and the users, would that be considered a sovereign act, a state act?
Yes.
So he'll enjoy immunity in perpetuity. Will he or won't he?
We make a distinction because there is the Rome Statute, which created the International Criminal Court, and under the Rome
that would be under just Cogent's rules.
Well, that's one, but it's more of a head of state or a diplomat commits acts which are crimes against humanity, or commits war crimes. Under the Rome Statute, there is no immunity from arrest or from the criminal jurisdiction of the International Criminal Court. So Duterte would not be immune from the jurisdiction of the International Criminal Court, because it is a signatory to the Rome Statute, which created the International Criminal Court. Now, however, had it been some other crime that was committed, and it did not amount to a crime against humanity, let's assume that he ordered the killing of 10 students because those students, made bad statements against Duterte, which angered him, and he killed 10 of them and even tortured them. In all likelihood, if that were just the incident, the killing of 10 people, that is unlikely to meet the requirements of being a crime against humanity. So in that case, yes, Duterte would be free from the criminal jurisdiction, even of the ICC. But when it comes to war crimes and crimes against humanity, as we see in week 9, I think, of our unit, if a state is a party to the Rome Statute, which created the International Criminal Court, then that state can be, even diplomats and heads of state can be subject to criminal jurisdiction of the ICC. We will also see that in week 9, that it is not just really, let's assume that you have a state that is not a party to the Rome Statute. Let's assume. Are we clear? So in the example that we gave, which the good question that Ilyonka had, you had a president whose state is a party to the Rome Statute, and obviously for that reason, the ICC has jurisdiction over the head of state of that particular state. But let's assume that you have the head of state of a state that is not a party to the Rome Statute, and that head of state happened to have committed war crimes. The question is, can that head of state potentially be the subject to criminal jurisdiction of the international community? The answer is yes.
Okay, so is that where, sorry, and I may be getting ahead of myself, because at the moment my frustration is that it seems that a lot of people can get away with a lot of things in public international law, and I'm sure that we'll get to it. But is that where the Security Council comes in?
That's right.
So if you've got a head of state that has, okay.
The UN Security Council can create war crime tribunals, and that has happened actually. It's not just the ICC which has jurisdiction over criminal acts. The UN Security Council can create war crimes tribunals, and that has happened with the heads of state of Bosnia-Herzegovina, as well as I think a lot of foreign states which are not signatories to or parties to the Rome Statute. But the UN Security Council created the international criminal courts to try these heads of state for war crimes. And the rule there is that if a head of state or any government functionary has committed war crimes, even if they did it during their tenure as heads of state, they still are not immune from criminal jurisdiction of the International Criminal Court or the actions of the UN Security Council in creating international war crimes tribunals. We're clear? Very good. Let me just change the facts a bit, okay? Let's assume that he is just the Consul General of the State of Leonario, but he was not an accredited diplomat. So a Consul General, in other words, is not necessarily a diplomat, okay? Those are two different things. So the diplomats would be the ambassador plenipotentiary, and so on. The consular officers are a different group of foreign state agents. Let's assume that Mr. Blast is not an accredited diplomat, but he is the Consul General of the State of Leonario and accredited as Consul General of the State of Leonario in Ontario. The question is he immune from the criminal jurisdiction of the receiving state, in this case, Ontario? So assuming that the Consul General, meaning Mr. Blast, is not a diplomat, although he is an accredited Consul General of the State of Leonario, changing the facts a bit, is he immune from the criminal jurisdiction of Ontario?
No, he's not.
Okay. Very good. So if you look at the 1963 Vienna Convention on Consular Relations, consular officers shall not be liable to arrest or detention pending trial, except in the case of a grave crime and assuming that there is a decision by a competent judicial authority. So that's different. So if you speak of a diplomatic agent, they are immune from the criminal jurisdiction of a receiving state. But if you talk about consular officers, for as long as the trial is pending, they are free from arrest or detention. But if they commit a grave crime and there is a court order, a court decision by a competent judicial authority, that consular officer can be subject to the criminal jurisdiction of a foreign court and subject to arrest and detention. So that's the distinction there. So we're clear? We're good? Very good. So that's the question. Okay, this is different. Can I just read this just to make it quicker, because it's 7:50 now. In question 2, assume that the State of Leonario is not a signatory to the 1963 Vienna Convention on Consular Relations. And let's assume as well that the State of Leonario is not a signatory to the 1961 Vienna Convention on Diplomatic Relations, because let's assume, for example, that the State of Leonario is a new state and it did not bother becoming a party to either of these conventions. Okay, are we clear? Question. Can Mr. Blast claim immunity from arrest if it is not a party to the Vienna Convention on diplomatic relations or Vienna Convention on consular relations?
I would say yes.
Go on, Ilionka. Why do you say that?
So I think that the stipulations of that treaty has sufficiently been entered into customary international law. That's
right. Very good. So this is a crucial point here, that it is possible that the contents of a treaty would actually develop into customary international law. And an example of customary international law is actually immunity of states from suit, as well as immunity of diplomatic agents and consular officers from arrest. That is part of customary international law. Very clear? Very good. Very good. Okay, how about this one? Question 4. Can I get somebody to read question 4 for us? Question 4.
I'll read it for you.
Thank you, Dean.
The state of Maryland created the Maryland Broadcasting Company, NBC, a government-owned corporation tasked with the building of the international profile of the state of Maryland. A series of media advertisements of the NBC use copyrighted material belonging to Global Media Company, GMC, a Candyland private company. Assume that the media advertisements of NBC violated copyright laws of the state of Candyland. The GMC intends to sue the state of Maryland and the courts of Candyland for indemnity for the copyright violation. Advise GMC about the prospects of such legal action.
Very good. So what we have here is a company that is a government-owned corporation. Okay, government-owned corporation tasked with building the international profile of the state of Maryland. It seems to have violated copyright laws of the foreign state. The question is, can the Maryland Broadcasting Company be sued for copyright violation before the courts of the state of Candyland? I changed the names because a lot of you, had difficulty pronouncing the names of the foreign-sounding names of states that I use. So I used Maryland and Candyland. But let's not be deceived. The idea here, these are meant to be states, foreign nation states. Okay. So we have a government-owned corporation created by the state of Maryland. Can the government-owned corporation be sued before the courts of the state of Candyland for violation of the copyright laws of the state of Candyland? What do you think?
Yes.
Okay. What's your basis for that answer, Dean?
Well, they are building an international profile. It's hardly a sovereign act. That's a commercial act, isn't it?
I'm not sure. It depends on the way you argue. Possibly. Okay, possibly. Let's assume, however, that this is a public act. It's not commercial. Public act. But it is a public act which is done by, my focus now, because it's always subject to argument, right? Whether it's a commercial act or a government act, so that's good. At least we know that legal issue there. But for the moment, let's just assume that this is a government act. Let's just assume for the moment. The question, however, is that if this is a government act, but the government act was undertaken by a government-owned corporation, the question is that particular government-owned corporation subject to suit or not? I say that because you can have a central bank which is actually a government-owned corporation. I think there are states which are like that. and they may end up having postage stamps or even currency being printed by a foreign company. Did you know that? That it's actually some foreign companies that do print the currency and stamps of these foreign states. And so, assuming that these acts are considered to be public because it's printing currency of a government, but it is undertaken by a government-owned corporation. So the legal issue now is, does the fact that a public act is undertaken by a government-owned corporation, does it make the government-owned corporation no longer immune from suit? That is the question.
Yeah, Manjo.
Michael?
Does it? I think I'm just reading something. It says state immunity has also been extended to state agencies and instrumentalities.
That's right. That's the correct answer there. Under the Foreign State Immunities Act, 1985, Commonwealth of Australia, there is what is known as a separate entity, and separate entities are entities which happen to be agencies or instrumentalities of the foreign states, but they're not necessarily departments or organs of the executive government of the foreign state. So, for example, a government-owned corporation. And in the case, for example, of Australian Competition and Consumer Commission versus PT Garuda Indonesia, a case decided by the Federal Court of Australia in 2010, the fact alone that the activities of the PT Garuda Indonesia were considered to be governmental acts, but the fact alone that they were undertaken by a government-owned corporation did not mean that that government-owned corporation necessarily was no longer immune from suit, because it can still be considered a separate entity. So in other words, under the FSIA Act of Australia, if it is a separate entity which is undertaking public acts, that separate entity is still subject to immunity from suit. Only when that separate entity is undertaking commercial transactions, so it is not so much the character of the entity undertaking the act. It's not so much that, but the nature of the transaction itself. So if the nature of the transaction is that it is a public act, even if it is undertaken by a separate entity, that separate entity will still be immune from suit. And this case, as pointed out by Ilionka as well, was decided by the UK Court of Appeal in the case of Trentex Corporation versus Central Bank of Nigeria, where the UK Court of Appeal decided that sovereign immunity applies to an alter ego or organ of a foreign state government, for as long as it is undertaking sovereign acts and not commercial acts. We're clear? Questions? Do I have another final question here? Yeah, so this one we've answered that. And so no questions there in question 4? So final question, question 5. Let me just read the question, because we've already answered question 6, right? That's when the Maryland Air Force bombed. We said that that was a sovereign act, immune from suit. So in question 5, a Maryland diplomat smuggled drugs into Candyland. He was intercepted after a sniffer dog grew excited because of the bag he was carrying. Can he be asked to open his bag for inspection, assuming that he claims diplomatic immunity and assuming that he is an accredited diplomat? So can you imagine, as I said, an example might be that there is a dirty bomb containing nuclear materials, and it is in a diplomatic bag. Can the diplomatic bag be opened or detained?
No, diplomatic bags can't be opened by. Can't be opened. It's a part of it's part of the state's immunity.
Very good.
It's how states have gotten around doing some fairly interesting things, like smuggling people.
Yeah. Smuggling guns. Of course, you would assume that embassies have guns, right? But yeah, when I read the books by Daniel Silva about this Gabriel Alon, the Israeli assassin, and he goes to another state let's say France, he'd end up, smuggling guns in a diplomatic pouch. So Jack Marshall is correct. If you look at the 1961 Vienna Convention diplomatic relations, particularly Article 27, it provides that the diplomatic bags shall not be opened or detained. So that's international law for us. And, it may appear strange, but that is what the states have agreed on. Yeah, so we're talking of arms, right? Weapons that embassies keep in their embassies. Okay, very good. So we've covered the 6 questions tonight, and it's 8:01. Before we end tonight's session, does anyone have a question or a comment?
Yeah, Manjo, I just had one quick question. So you're referring to state immunity, and is state immunity extended to state immunity is extended to embassies of foreign soil, but not to consular houses. Is it extended to naval vessels of a foreign military, and then is it further then to aircraft? Because I was aware that it was extended under the law of the sea, that naval vessels enjoyed it, but I wasn't sure if aircraft did.
They are, not because of the Vienna Convention on Diplomatic Relations, but under customary international law, as far back as the 1800s, it had always been assumed, in the case of France versus Turkey, for example, that naval military vessels are considered to be belong to the territory of the state carrying the flag. So it is immune from suit. It is immune from the civil jurisdiction of any court, so they cannot be seized. Let's assume that you have a state that owes money to another state. So let's assume that there is a court which has entered judgment, finding a particular state to be subject to damages worth, let's say, $50 million, but they couldn't find any commercial property belonging to that foreign state. Can its naval vessels be subject to detention or even forfeiture by the courts of that state which render judgment? The answer is no. They are immune based on customary international law. But that was different in the case of Saddam Hussein, right? Because I think they seized the aircraft of Saddam Hussein. But that's a different story altogether. That's a different, because that, to the victor of war, they can do what they like, especially if it's the United States. Okay, any questions, comments before we end tonight's session? So we're good. Okay, so Merry Christmas, all is fair in love and war. Yeah. So Merry Christmas, everyone. I hope to see you after the new year. Good night. Bye.
Merry Christmas, Manjo.
Thank you, Bidang. Merry Christmas, everyone. Bye.